he's only allowed monitored video calls, and during those calls, the mother has seen signs of physical abuse, abuse that she's unable to protect her daughter from. What's staggering is that it seems like nobody can do anything.
I'm Jane.
I'm Ruth, and I coordinate the FiLiA Hague Mothers campaign.
And I'm Beth.
And this is
Insightful Sisters.
All right. So, Ruth, thank you so much for doing this for us. I came across you at FiLiA, the FiLiA conference, the women's conference in 2022, which seems a long time ago. And you were launching a charity, the Hague Mothers, at that point. And I was astounded. It blew me out of the water. This was something that had been set up. The Hague Convention, had been set up to do something so good and so noble, and it had gone so badly wrong. So, for those people out there who may not know, can you just tell us a bit about what's the Hague Convention?
It's the Hague Abduction Convention, and it was set up in 1980, as you say, for a really good purpose, a really honourable purpose. And that was, there was a realisation internationally that some abusive fathers, at the breakdown of a relationship, would decide to take their child, kidnap their child or abduct their child, take them to their home country of Saudi or to South America or North America, or, in order to have vengeance on the mother, but also for FGM, for child marriage, to bring them up in a patriarchal religion. So the child was assumed to be in extreme danger. And the Hague Convention, which is now signed by 103 countries, ensures that the full power of the law can be brought to bear to find the person who was assumed to be the father, the kidnapper, and return the child really quickly, within 6 weeks ideally, to the mother, the primary carer.
As we said before, that sounds very noble.
Yes.
So what went wrong, and why did you feel you had to set up a charity?
Well, in the intervening years, there's been a change, first of all, in people's movement about the globe. So there are far more international relationships now than there were in the past. But also there's been an understanding of domestic violence that wasn't there in 1980, sadly. Not that it wasn't happening, but people didn't register how significant it was in the breakdown of relationships. And so what has happened over the intervening years since 1980 is that at first, 100% of the cases were brought by parent mothers against fathers. And now there's been a change. And so only 25% of cases are brought against fathers, and 75% of cases are brought by fathers, abusive fathers, against mothers who are trying to escape domestic abuse, violence, sexual abuse of their children, and trying to come home to safety.
So women that are trying to escape violence are ending up not just trying to escape violence, but are now being pursued by the law.
Yes. Yes. And what is so tragic is that The Hague is incredibly efficient. And so it absolutely does what it was intended to do. That is, it returns the child really quickly to the country that it came from. And that country has called its habitual residence. So the child is returned to habitual residence. If the mother doesn't want to return, she doesn't have to, but of course she wants to return because she wants to continue to protect her child. But when she goes back with the child under the Hague Convention, she's at an extreme risk of actually losing custody because she goes back as an abductor. She goes back to increased violence. She goes back to a vengeful father who now has support from the state and has been given legal aid by the state to bring the case against her. So everything is against her. And the outcomes of The Hague are not, they don't collect data about it. So we only know anecdotally, but it would seem that the outcomes of The Hague for protective mothers are absolutely disastrous. So they go back, there's increased abuse, they frequently lose contact with their children. Some mothers go back to places where they don't have visas anymore because they're no longer married or with their
partner. Are they there illegally then?
Well, yes. So they actually have to leave again because they're not allowed to stay. Or they might have a visa, but it doesn't allow them to work. And so they're dependent on the state. The state doesn't always give them any support, or they're dependent on their abusive ex-partner. And you can imagine the power and control that that gives the father.
Yeah.
So it's moved from being a really good, honourable and effective measure, being something that actually harms or further harms people who are already victims of violence and abuse.
I mean, it's a tragedy, isn't it? It's a tragedy for those mothers. So your response to this? Tell us what the charity is called the Hague Mothers, and it's a FiLiA adopted charity. But tell us why you set it up, because it's quite an interesting story, isn't it?
Yes, I don't have any background in the law or indeed in violence against women. So I was associated with FiLiA, it was a feminist organisation, as you say, just sort of on the sidelines. But although I've been a lifelong feminist, I'd sort of thought things were getting better, and I'd sort of moved to the sidelines. Anyway, I happened to be on Mumsnet, and I was just talking about various issues that had started to come to the fore about women's rights and women fighting back and saying that their rights were being undermined. So I was on this thread talking about these things, and suddenly onto the thread there came a very eloquent and quite angry woman who was saying basically she felt it was really important that women had single-sex spaces, particularly for rape crisis centres and shelters. And she hadn't been able to find one. And she turned out to be in the States, and she turned out to be undocumented, and she turned out to be somebody who was fleeing a murderously violent husband. And there was something about the way she wrote on this Mumsnet thread that just engaged me. And so I started directly contacting her, and we became very firm friends. And in my usual way, I thought, well, I can fix this. I can find her a better lawyer, or she can get a violence against women visa to stay in the States. I can do something. I can help. And I kept suggesting things, and she was very patient with me, but she just would not listen to any of my bright ideas. And eventually, as we got to know each other better and she began to trust me, it turned out she wasn't just fleeing from her murderous husband, she was fleeing from the Hague Convention, which had already sent her back previously with her children.
So what was her story? She'd married. Where had she married? Where had she had her children? All of that sort of thing.
Yes, I won't give her country. Only yes,
Okay.
she has to stay on the radar. But yes, she'd married a foreign man. She was working in a foreign country. She'd married a foreign man, very charming. And then she became pregnant, and the violence started, and the violence was quite horrific. So her first child, when she was pregnant with her first child, she was beaten up just before, I think about 9 months pregnant, and she went into premature labour. She came home with the baby from hospital. She was in a country where there's very little support for domestic violence victims. She came home with the baby and she was beaten up again. She went to the embassy, and actually the embassy helped her get home because she was in such a bad state. But the embassy said to her, we'll help you get home, but you might have a Hague petition against you, and we can't help you if that happens. And that is what happened. And so she eventually managed to escape and went on the run, basically, and still is. Though I've now met her, I went over to see her, and that was quite magical, actually, to meet that woman who started this whole thing. I just felt the injustice was so extreme that I thought I had to do something about it. And so I knew I couldn't do it on my own. So I went to FiLiA and I said, please, can you help me do something about this? And they said, yes, of course. And so the Hague Mothers project was born. And the session you heard us at, the 2022 session in Cardiff, was the launch of it. That's when we started working on it.
How many mothers do you support?
That's very difficult to say. I mean, we get emails from mums every day, basically, and sometimes their mothers. It's incredibly ordinary women. It could be anybody. So some mothers are stuck in a country which is not their country of origin. They want to leave. They want to come home. They want to be safe, and they know about the Hague, so they know they can't, and they want to know what can they do. Some mothers have already left and suddenly hear about the Hague because the Hague petition hits them. And so they come to us asking what they can do. Some mothers have lost the Hague case and have been returned and are facing extreme violence and abuse and don't know what to do. So it's any mother basically who's in an international relationship or in a relationship with somebody from their own country but living abroad, and that person wants to continue living abroad even after the relationship has broken down. Any woman with children can find herself at the mercy of the Hague Abduction Convention. It could happen to anyone.
Gosh, it's. I mean, it sounds like it's a really necessary charity that you've set up, and you're sort of doing two prongs of it, really, aren't you? Because you're supporting actual people, but also you're campaigning and trying to change the law.
Yes, and indeed, we didn't set up as a frontline organisation. It's an entirely voluntary organisation. We don't have offices, we don't have phones, we just have the International Sisterhood. And so we knew we didn't have the capacity to be a frontline organisation. So what we do is we signpost to partners, but we also became aware that there were very few organisations that were set up to support these women on the front line.
Yeah.
And so very frequently we find ourselves just doing whatever we can. And generally what we can is now we have this extraordinary network of members and partners across the world. And they're lawyers and human rights specialists and child psychologists and media people and women's rights activists and feminists and I mean just everybody you can think of and Hague Mothers themselves. And so what we're able to do is to put mothers in touch with people who know how to help them. And that I think is worth the world. It's speaking to somebody who believes you is such a comfort. Even if they can't find a way to get you out of this problem, just to know there's somebody there who cares, who understands and believes you, it makes a difference.
That's amazing. I mean, I'm really struck by what you said. You know, you've met somebody on Facebook and you contacted them and you set this thing up. You know, that says a little bit about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? Because I don't think you've got a legal background, have you?
No, I don't. I don't have anything particularly useful, really. Except one of the things I do have is I was a born optimist, and my partner used to say it was like living with an incontinent Labrador puppy. And indeed, working in this arena, that's actually really helpful because what we're trying to do is, in a sense, impossible. And yet I'm so optimistic, I don't believe it's impossible. I believe we can do it together. So my actual background is as an academic. I was head of creative communications department in a university in Cardiff, and that was a fabulous job. And then there was redundancy, so I left. And then I thought I'd do something rather different. So I got involved in something called co-production, which I suppose is the closest area of skills to what I'm doing now. And co-production is just a way of working with the community. So that instead of professionals coming in and saying, this is what you need and this is what the solution is, a bit like I've been doing with the woman I met in America. Rather than that, you work together as partners. So the people who have the problem or the people in need actually have an equal say in what the solution might be. So it's a very democratic way of working with no hierarchies and with everybody being truly valued for what they can offer, however small, however large. And that whole co-productive approach is very similar to the way that FiLiA itself works. And it's the way that this network has been set up. So as I said, we don't have any paid staff, except we've just been given some funding, which is completely glorious, by a great organisation called Treebeard Trust. So from the 6th of January, I will have a part-time admin assistant.
Oh, wonderful.
Will make a world of difference.
I bet. Yeah, I bet. So I think I'm going to pass you across to Bex. I think she's got some questions for you now.
Yes. So what I really want to focus on in particular is where this Hague Convention is going wrong for women. So you've sort of spoken briefly about the remedy of immediate return. And this seems to be a major part of the issue here. Could you explain a little bit about how that's maybe being used to crush any discussion around the better interests of the child and the mother?
Yes, I think you put your finger on the major contradiction within the whole Hague Convention and the way it's implemented. And the convention is based on a number of assumptions that were once true. So the first assumption is that an abductor, which is simply somebody who takes the child across an international border without permission from the other parent. That's it. So the assumption is that the abductor is a dangerous person, a danger to the child, and that abduction in its own right is a form of abuse. So once you have that assumption, which was at the heart of the original convention, then the fact that the mother is actually trying to protect the child doesn't count, because the assumption overrides the reality. And I think that's partly because data is not being collected, not by the Hague Bureau itself and not by individual states. So the child is returned with the assumption that by returning the child, you are returning the child to safety. That's part of the assumption. If they're taken by a dangerous person, and that's an act of abuse, by returning them, you're bringing them to safety. So that's the second assumption that is operating here. And if you don't collect stories from mothers, if you don't collect outcomes, if you don't know how many of the mothers are alleging domestic violence, whether they're using that as a defense or not, you continue to believe that the return of the child is in the best interest of the child. And so when we have pointed out that very frequently that return, because it's not monitored, it's not checked up on, has not been in the best interest of the child, and very frequently the child has lost its mother through that return and ended up with a perpetrator father, then there is some recognition that the convention is going wrong. But that recognition is quite slow to come, because it's been a long time now, since 1980, where the assumption has been that it's working really well. And in its own right, it is. So that return default is, yes, that's the heart of the problem.
What's important to note is there are exceptions to this remedy of immediate return, as it's called. And amongst them are grave risks of harm or intolerable situations. And there's also exceptions for human rights and for the objections of the children. Now, all three of them, you could very easily argue from a modern perspective, are clear indicators that when there's evidence or even an allegation of abuse towards the child or of a dangerous or abusive home environment, there should be a pause on that immediate return and an investigation should be carried out. Why doesn't that happen?
I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the exceptions are named exceptions because they are exceptional. So there is, the default still holds, and the expectation is that those exceptions will be rarely needed or rarely used. So if we have 75% of cases are mothers, and possibly up to 100% of those are fleeing domestic violence, it's no longer an exception. And yet, that's still, it's another assumption. Yes, we only do this for exceptional circumstances. So 13B, for example, which is the defence that's normally used by mothers in this situation, which is the one you mentioned, you can't retain the child if there's a grave risk of harm or that will put them in an intolerable situation. That was intended for war, natural disasters, cataclysmic plagues. I mean, it was intended for truly exceptional circumstances. And as far as many courts and many judges are concerned, because they don't necessarily keep up with the latest research on domestic violence doesn't count as a serious risk. And particularly there's a lack of understanding that domestic violence against the mother impacts on a child. There's an assumption that you can separate those two things out completely. And we know that that's also true in our family court situation. You know, it's not just the international courts that are problematic in this regard. So the whole judicial system is very, very slow to catch up. And I think there's a lot of misogyny at play, where fathers' rights and fathers' rights to contact trump the mother's right to safety. So that main defence wasn't intended for domestic violence, even though it's used because it's virtually the only one that mothers can use. It still isn't. It doesn't sit very easily in that context within the court. And the others you mentioned, so the one about the child's objections, again, there are different attitudes towards children and their maturity and their right to object, and attitudes to children as possessions in different jurisdictions. There are different attitudes to how you listen to a child, and if you listen to a child, and do you need to be a specialist, or does the judge think that they can just sit with the child and in 20 minutes work out what the child needs? But also, and this is again a really critical problem with the Hague, the child's objection can't be to go back to the context they were in or to have to leave their mother. The child's objection can only be to the country that they left, their habitual residence. So they can object, certainly when they were taken from Australia and brought to Britain, they have to object to living in Australia. They can't object to going back to their abusive father. And so that, again, it seems like it might be a way forward for mothers, but it absolutely isn't. Yeah,
But for a child to try to construct that argument be incredibly difficult, even for quite a sort of older child, for a teenager, it would be difficult to formulate an argument against the country when so often in these cases the issue isn't the country, it is that they are escaping abuse.
absolutely.
It's
And
almost as if it's been outlawed to mention.
yes, and we have this problem also of parental alienation allegations, which I'm sure you've come across, where it's a exquisite way in which abusive fathers actually turn the tables on the mothers. So the child the child and the mother can, for example, say that there has been sexual abuse of the child. The mother can say it, the child can say it, they can both absolutely agree. And the court makes the assumption that the mother has coached the child and is lying in order to alienate the child from the father. And in fact, in Brazil, it is a criminal offence. Parental alienation is a criminal offence. So mothers have stopped even trying to allege domestic violence or domestic abuse, sexual abuse, because they're so scared that a parental abuse allegation will come back at them and they will lose custody. It's just extraordinary, yeah, upturning of how it should be.
I mean, I'm interested that you mentioned Brazil because that is shocking, but it does lead on to my next question, which is really what about the child protective services or the sort of duty, the welfare duty that these countries have over their citizens, over women or children? Because these mothers typically are returning to their home country, to their support network, to their families. These countries surely feel some sense of protective duty over these women and their children. Once they return that child to the country of the father, of the abuser, that they have no input or no say in any child protection processes that continue from that, or if there even are any child protection processes, or if it's just considered a closed case. Oh, that child was abducted and now they're returned. Good. Book shut. You know, how are countries responding to that? Has there been any sort of dissent on that point?
Very slowly. But yes, there is a sense that some countries are feeling a little uneasy, to put it no more strongly than that, with the fact that on one hand they signed the Istanbul Convention or the Beijing Convention or they signed up to CEDAW, and so they are signatories to frameworks, human rights frameworks, children's rights frameworks that should protect both mother and child. And a lot of governments, such as our own, make a big noise about helping women escape from violence and helping victims of violence. So there is a slowly dawning appreciation that that set of fundamental obligations uh, is trumped by the Hague Convention. The Hague Convention has a lot of power. So the Hague Convention, once a petition is brought, you can actually be arrested at gunpoint and your child taken. It's the full force of the law can be brought by the Hague, whereas something like CEDAW is just an advisory response. So there is that understanding, and some countries, for example, Australia, I know became quite uneasy at the fact that they were returning children to at least difficult situations, but also to some known abusive situations. And they have started to make some small changes to their domestic implementation. So you can't change the Hague itself, because you have to have 103 signatories saying yes to any changes. But you can make changes, for example, to the guidance of the Hague or to the way you implement it in your own country. So one of the things that they've done in Australia is they've decided that the mothers should also be able to apply for legal aid. And that alone would make a big difference, because it would mean the mothers wouldn't have to try and defend themselves in these quite complex cases. So there are things that can be done. And indeed, Brazil is in the process, but I don't know if it will go through, of bringing a case to their Supreme Court asking about the constitutionality of the Hague Convention in relation to their own domestic violence against women laws. So that small leverage is something that we really intend to follow up on next year, because we feel this is a human rights abuse at its heart. And I think that's the way we will approach it in the future, strategically.
Can I ask about the funding for legal advice? How does
Yes,
that work? Does that favour the women?
no, nothing favours the women. The situation is different in different countries, but in many countries there is automatic legal aid from the state to the left behind parent, the petitioning parent. So in 75% of cases, to the father. There is not legal aid available to mothers generally. The legal aid that's available to fathers also comes from the central authority in the particular country, in the particular jurisdiction. And the central authority has a lot of experience, therefore, in The Hague. So they have really good lawyers. They have lawyers who are used to working with the left behind parent and making that case. And so what has happened is that lawyers who are able to make the much tougher case, which supports the mum in these circumstances, are few and far between. They're generally not paid, because the mum can't get legal aid, or it's checked against her income and also against the merits of her case. And because it's so difficult to win a Hague case, she often doesn't prove to be the right subject in that regard. So there's a shortage of lawyers who understand domestic violence, coercive control, trauma, impact on the child, and The Hague. And there's a shortage of lawyers who are able to work pro bono, and a shortage of legal aid. So at every step, the moment the mum makes that decision, goes across an international border, she is really, equality of arms has gone out the window. Her ability to get justice or to find safety is really curtailed.
It seems so upsetting, because it's the natural drive of any person that's found themselves and their child in a dangerous or abusive situation. Anybody that finds themselves in that situation would naturally sort of want to flee, want to move towards their support network and towards a familiar country. Is there typically warning about this to women in these situations? Are domestic abuse services aware generally that if a woman's from a foreign country and wants to return home, she may come across this?
No, that's another problem, of course. And it's one of the things that the FiLiA Hague Mothers campaign is hoping to be able to address. Again, we can do a tremendous amount without funds, but there are certain things like getting information out to lots of places, lots of countries, in lots of languages that do take funding. So we've been quite slow to be able to make any inroads in that regard. I mean, lots of mothers have said to us that we should try to get information into every embassy in every signatory country, which would be wonderful. It would mean that when you're applying for visas to go and live abroad, that you at least knew of the existence of this convention, and that if you had children abroad or already had children and took them abroad, that could mean that your right to leave was curtailed until that child was 16. And I think if people knew this, if there were any sort of cracks in the relationship, it might give them pause for thought. But at the moment, no, mums don't know about it. A lot of lawyers don't know about it. Domestic violence organisations don't know about it. So one of the things we're intending to do right now, we've set up a small team who are going to put together resources for domestic violence organisations. We already have a leaflet, which is on our website, in which we sent round to all the main women's aid organisations in the UK and Ireland and Scotland. But we're going to do one more comprehensive, and we're also going to for some free training to domestic violence organisations. And one of our partners, Global Arc, is doing something similar. And there are other partners of ours in different countries who are trying to do something similar. And we're working together as far as we can so we don't replicate. But yes, that's the key thing. At least if mothers know, then then they know what they're letting themselves in for. One of the difficulties is in giving advice about what to do. So if a mum comes to us in that sort of situation, she's in a foreign country, she wants to go home, she's in an abusive relationship, and she says to us, what do I do? It's really hard because the options are so few. The legal option, and it's not available in every signatory country, is to apply for relocation or leave to remove. And that is the one option. So it's not always available. So Sweden doesn't offer it, for example, to mums. And that, well, it takes a long time, so at least 6 months, but it could be several years. It costs a lot of money. I mean, thousands of pounds it costs. While you're applying for leave to remove, if you're in an abusive relationship, you can imagine that the abuse will escalate seriously, and your chances of success are not great because there is an assumption that fathers need to be part of a child's life, and that counters a mother's right to safety and liberty. And that's the only legal route. So if some mums decide to go into exile, which brings its own desperate problems because they place themselves outside the law and they are a fugitive. And mums come to us saying, "This is what I'm going to do. I have no other choice. I will go to a country that isn't a Hague signatory, so I can't be brought back by the Hague," which they can't. But if the father has an idea about where they might be, he can send a private detective, find them, and kidnap the child right back again. And he's within his legal rights to do that. And once that's happened, she has no choice. And also, we know about mums who've gone into exile and they've had the courts in the country they've fled from have decided to put a stop on their bank accounts, that family and friends are prevented from contacting them, or perhaps too frightened to contact them, lest they're being hacked and the perpetrator finds out where the mum is. Then there may be visa problems, there may be working problems. The whole thing is really incredibly difficult. And one of our new partners, they're called Lift, and they are an informal support group of mothers in exile who've done just this because they didn't know what else to do. And very recently, we've had some mums who come to us asking about asylum. If you can get asylum, then it counters the Hague. Most things don't counter the Hague. The Hague takes precedence over a whole raft of human rights expectations that I believed in until I became involved in this. But if you can get asylum, claiming domestic violence and evidence in domestic violence or sexual abuse against a child, that sort of a really serious issue, then that would counter a Hague petition, and that would keep you safe. But you know, these things, they take time, they take money, they take lawyers, they take, yeah, it's not easy.
No, no, absolutely. And I mean, I suppose one issue that we've sort of danced around is the difference in policy around, you know, domestic violence, in the difference in handling it between different countries which are signatories. I mean, it seems an awful lot of change needs to be made on a huge scale in order to make this function. But I see on your site that you do say it's unlikely that they'll ever sort of throw it out and start again. So, what sort of changes do you think could be made to begin moving in a direction where this functions as it should?
Well, one of our new strategy is to really put states who are signed up to human rights obligations and human rights framework, CEDAW, like Istanbul Convention. And what is happening at the moment to their ignoring their obligations to their citizens under those conventions in order to maintain their allegiance to the Hague Convention. And this has started to cause some concern in some countries. So Australia is concerned that it is not protecting essentially female victims of domestic violence and abuse because it is sending the children back and the mothers are going with them. So the Attorney General in Australia is on record saying he is concerned about protecting women and children. And they've started to make some small steps to their domestic implementation of the Hague. So the Hague in the centre stays as it is, but the way you can implement it can change slightly. So, for example, they've decided that mothers can get legal aid. At the moment, the way that it's done is still through the central authority, which is the authority that generally work with fathers. And it's very clumsy, we think, and it's not working terribly well. And we're in conversation with the UK Ministry of Justice about this, the same thing, and they're not adverse to the idea. And if mothers were given legal aid as a matter of course, as fathers are, that would make a phenomenal difference because they would be supported, but also it would mean that there would be a body of lawyers would come into existence to support them in these complex cases. Whereas at the moment, there's just a very small number of lawyers who can work with them. And generally, those lawyers can't take on as many pro bono cases as are needed by the mums. So that would help immeasurably. And it's something that could be done relatively easy and relatively cheaply. But one of our fundamental arguments is that the idea of abduction, as defined in the original convention, is completely at variance with what these mothers are doing. These are protective mothers trying to keep themselves and their children safe. An abductor is somebody who takes a child or somebody across a border against their will and meaning them harm. So our argument is that actually the Hague should not be available in cases of domestic violence. So if there's proven domestic violence, we think it's just be off the table. It wasn't meant for that purpose. If there's an allegation of domestic violence, we would suggest that the time frame, because the Hague cases are meant to be heard and decided within 6 weeks. So we're saying if there's an allegation of domestic violence, there should be a fact finding, even if that extends the amount of time. So these are not huge changes, but they would be sufficient to bring the Hague Convention back to its original honourable purpose, or to move it successfully in that direction. And there are various other things. You mentioned the voice of the child here. I think if children were really allowed to speak, and if they were speaking to people who had expertise, not only in listening and hearing the psychology of children, the psychology of victims as well, because of course these children are quite ambiguous and scared in terms of what they say because they've been under pressure from abusive parent. If you had that, that would start to help. The convention was supposed to be about the best interests of the child, but it's lost that heart. And I think if that came back, it would help a lot. And one of the other things that we're pressing for is for the Hague Special Bureau and countries who are signatories to start to collect information about the outcomes of these decisions, because there's just an assumption that you send the child back and that's the right decision. But
And
actually,
that's something that you're doing in a way, isn't it? You are collecting some
we
of the
are.
stories of the mothers. I mean, the stories that are on your website are so incredibly moving.
Oh, absolutely. And these aren't rare. I mean, we're just one organisation. There are lots of organisations, and I think we persuaded, or the Hague Special Bureau and the Secretary General agreed to hold a forum on the Hague and domestic violence and 13B, the defence I mentioned earlier, last June in South Africa, and we had videos of mums. We had two mothers, and it was so powerful. At the beginning of the forum, and it's 100 people at the forum itself, invited guests, and then about 300 people online. And the invited guests included representatives of all the main signatories and senior judges and lawyers and ambassadors, and it was a senior gathering, and a lot of the initial panels were about legal issues and the sort of theory of the convention, and then we ran a panel which was Mothers' Voices of Experience, and it hit the room like a bomb. It was absolutely extraordinary, and I think one of the issues is that it's not that these are bad people doing bad things deliberately. It's just that they don't know.
Yes.
And I think that audience hearing, perhaps for the first time, probably for the first time, the reality of the impact of what they've done must have made a difference. And I think it's through those sorts of stories, through that reality, and lots of lobbying and advocacy and support to help people change. There is a possibility of movement. It really was it was, I will never forget it, actually. One of the stories that was told at the forum was by an Australian mum who is the founder of Her Hague Story, which is one of our partners, and they're an Australian support group for mums. And her courage, her determination in the face of what is actually state-supported abuse, was formidable. And her story, which I first heard, I mean, a couple of years ago, really, when the campaign started, the basics are that when she was around 7 months pregnant, she was coerced to travel to Europe by her then partner. Mm-hmm. And critically, she was unable to return home for the birth due to abuse from her partner, which had caused medical complications. So she returned when the baby was just 7 months old, which is the first point at which she could manage to escape. She had a domestic violence order out against the father, and she was able to cite death threats and violence and abuse perpetrated against both her and against her little baby. But nonetheless, the Australia Family Court ruled that the Hague Convention needed to be upheld. And the child, who was a First Nations Australian citizen as well, which adds to the horror of it, was sent back to Europe. And the case got quite a lot of attention because it was literally just before Christmas, like 2 days before Christmas. And this 2-year-old girl, who was still breastfeeding, was literally taken from her mother, given to a man she didn't know. She'd last seen when she was 7 months old, and they weren't even still living together at that point, who had a domestic violence order against him, and flown back to Europe. I mean, it was just extraordinary.
That's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that
Yes,
could be allowed to happen.
it is, isn't it? And that is the Hague Convention being, yeah. So I was also really shocking was that her judge in Australia acknowledged within the judgment that she had chosen not to assess or uphold the best interest of the child. She doesn't have to. And she actually said, no, this is not about the best interest of the child. This is about returning the child according to the requirements of the Hague Convention. So, that was extraordinary. And the mum followed.
Of course,
Would. Yes, you would. Hoping at least to be able to see her child. I believe there were undertakings made that the mother would be able to co-parent. I'm not sure exactly what they were, but that was her expectation. I think there was a letter of guarantee, a 50-50 parenting. Anyway, he failed to keep that promise. He's only allowed monitored video calls, and during those calls, the mother has seen signs of physical abuse, abuse that she's unable to protect her daughter from. And I've seen photos of the child, and they were shown at the forum as well, cowering under the table, clearly traumatized. And I've heard recordings of some of the heartbreaking Zoom calls, one where the child says something like, "You put me in jail," to her mum, and another where she's standing in front of the camera with a bleeding lip and she says, "He hit me hard." And of course, corporal punishment of children is legal in this particular country. So she's tried to get social services involved in that country, but they're not interested. And then what happened next was that her visa ran out and she asked for it to be extended and it was refused. So she's had to go back home. It just beggars belief. And it seems that the convention is so powerful that nobody can do anything about it. So she's had messages of sympathy at a very high level from Australian politicians. But that's what's happened.
Is this on some level, would you say, like a bit of a misapplication? Because that would, from a logical standpoint, very easily come against the exception. Well, firstly, it'd come against the exception for human rights, but also definitely for the exception of grave risk of harm or an intolerable situation. But like you say, the judge sort of refused to look at the interests of the child. Do you feel like maybe there's been some fundamental misunderstanding of how these should be applied, these exceptions?
I don't, unfortunately. I think it's a sustained part of a patriarchal approach to justice. So laws are made for men, they're carried out for men, and they serve men. And UN Special Reporter on Violence Against Women and Girls, Reem Al-Salam, who is a supporter of ours and has really been fantastic in helping us in whatever way she can, in amongst all the other things she's trying to do in the world. And she wrote a report, I think 2023, and it's called Custody, Violence Against Women and Violence Against Children. And it's particularly about the family courts, but of course the Hague Court is an international family court. So it also mentions the Hague. And it talks about essentially misogyny, which underpins the way these courts work. And once I became involved with the Hague, I also became involved with family courts and started to learn a little about what happens there, because many Hague mums end up in family courts. And across the world, this minimization of domestic abuse, the bringing of parental alienation allegations to counter abuse allegations, giving custody to fathers even when they're known to be perpetrators, even when they're rapists. The whole setup of the courts minimizes what women go through, disbelieves them, endlessly disbelieves them, and prioritizes the male demand. So the UN Special Reporter's report lays that out globally, really clearly. And I think The Hague is just another aspect of that. And it's been allowed to, because the mothers themselves are generally silenced, so literally gagged, not allowed to talk about the cases. In family courts, you're not allowed to talk about the cases, except in rare occasions. And so they have no money, they have no power, they have no influence, they have nobody speaking for them, and they can't speak on their own behalf. So it's been, I mean, I think the campaigns now in the family courts and our campaigns are gathering pace, but it is a serious and significant patriarchal issue.
I mean, I think also it's every mother's absolute worst nightmare, I imagine.
Yeah.
And you know, that a law like this could exist, and the thought of having to losing your visa and having to return to your home country, knowing the situation that you were leaving your child in, is
Yeah,
harrowing to think about.
The thing
absolutely.
that it's making me feel is angry.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine how angry these mothers must be. And anger is a really difficult emotion to handle long term, isn't it? It can make you ill. It can make you irrational. The frustration and anger that they must feel about this. I have it. Is that your experience? Is anger a key thing that the mothers feel?
It is key. I think it's that sense of betrayal. Um, almost almost as bad as the original abuse. And they talk about legal abuse, and
Yeah.
this is what it is: state-sponsored abuse.
Mhm.
Those words I hear over and over again from mums, and it's that realization that these systems and structures that were apparently set up to protect you
Yeah.
have not only not protected you, but they have absolutely betrayed you. And you know that phrase in domestic violence circles about Darvo, about
Mhm.
how perpetrators deny, accuse, and then reverse victim and
Yeah.
offender. And I think that's what they see happening. So they go to the family court or they go to the Hague court to say, look, I am protecting myself and my child. And the court just says, don't care. Don't care. You go back.
It's terrible. It's so. What can we do? What can ordinary people do to raise your profile? What can governments do? What can ordinary people do? What can people do?
Well, I'm ordinary people. So so
Well, you know, actually, I'm going to disagree with that. You sort of you met someone on Mumsnet and set up a whole system to
Yeah.
support them.
I'm
So,
ordinary. I have
I
no
think
expectations.
I think there was a
do
silent extra on the front of that ordinary, actually.
extraordinary.
Well, nonetheless, I have no particular expertise. So I think people should know that. People should know that actually we can all contribute, we can all play a part. And I think if nothing else, if you speak to people about this, we just have this conversation, and because I can see your faces, and I'm seeing in your faces what my face must have looked like when I first heard about it. And I believe that if people, particularly women and mothers, know about it, they will be angry on behalf of other women and mothers. And we can start to create a formidable movement in the media. We can start to make a real noise about this, because it could happen and will happen more and more to our daughters, to our granddaughters, to our relatives, cousins, friends, as more and more women, we're in a global economy now.
Mhm.
People move about the country far more. So I tell friends about it. Go to our website and then tell other people about the website. And even if all they do is read a story or you share a story with them, that can be a real help, because I have found as soon as people's eyes are opened, they feel just like you do. They really want to do something. So talk to anybody you come across, and particularly to people you think might be in this demographic. Anybody who is thinking of partnering with somebody who lives in a foreign country, or thinking of going abroad with somebody to a foreign country, or might be about to have children in a foreign country, talk to them. Tell them that they would be better off making sure the child is at least born in their home country, which is some slight safeguard, and then they can take it from there. In the same way, if people would share our newsletter, so subscribe to our newsletter, which you can do on our website, and then share it with people as far and wide as they possibly can. Similarly, follow us on social media, amplify our voices in any way you can. And then the other thing, and this goes back to my determination that, yes, I am ordinary in this context, although I now work with truly extraordinary women across the world. If you have time or skills or passion to offer, come and help us. So the entire organization is the Global Sisterhood. If you want to join us, even if all you can do, in inverted commas, recently we decided we needed to get our leaflet translated. So we put out a call saying, does anybody speak any other language? If so, please translate a leaflet. That would only take half an hour, but it would really make a difference to somebody. Yeah. So it can be quite a small thing, or you can decide you want to ditch in and dedicate the rest of your life to it. That would do too. So yes, anybody who has any skills, any passions, any time, then please join us. And if you don't have that, then just talk about it endlessly until people start going off as soon as they see it coming.
Well, I hope in our little way we will hope we'll share this will share and hope other people will listen to it.
I'm sure. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much for being here. We do have, I suppose, one final question, which we do like to ask. For people who want to know more or around women who inspire you, is there any recommended reading or anyone that you'd like to direct listeners to in order to sort of learn more?
Well, one of my absolute heroes is Remal Salam. I find her phenomenal to take on half the world, supporting half the world in every possible dimension, particularly at this time, is really something. I've had the pleasure of meeting her just twice now, in person, and I think she is really somebody special. So I would encourage people to follow her, to support her, to find out what she's been up to. And if you have a look at our website and want to know more, then to read her paper on custody, violence against women and violence against children, because it really opens one's eyes to the fact that women do not receive justice, that women are absolutely second-class citizens as far as legislation is concerned across the world. And once you know that, then I think that anger you spoke about, Jane, you actually start directing it, and it becomes quite a positive force for action rather than just something to feel frustrated by. I have a load of other heroines. Basically, if you want to look on the Hague Mothers website at the team I work with, every single one of those women makes my heart beat faster. I mean, they are just utterly awesome. And one heroine that I can't give her name. One absolute heroine is a woman we're working with at the moment, who's right in the middle of this, and she's a mum of two children, and she, yes, I do get tired because it's quite powerful emotional things that we're dealing with. I do get tired, and then I watch her battling, and she, like a tiger mother. She's never going to give up. So I guess mothers of the world, yeah, they're my heroines too.
Well, that's really
Thank you.
inspirational. Thank you so much. I've learned
Yeah,
a lot there. Have you, Bex?
yeah, I think it's been equal parts devastating and inspiring.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, it's amazing work that you're doing. It's just such a tragedy that it has to be done. Um,
Yes, it is. It is a tragedy, and the only upside, and it is a powerful upside, is that you realise that international sisterhood is a thing. And you
yeah,
can actually reach out to women who've never met you, who don't know anything about you, and you can ask for help, and they give it. It, it's magical.
magical's the word. Thank you so much for talking to us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And as a final note, we'd love to thank our listeners for joining us this week. We hope that you found this episode interesting, and please, as Ruth says, do anything that you can to support and spread the word. If you want to keep up to date with new episodes and information about our podcast, you can follow us on Twitter at InsightfulPod. We are a brand new, independent, gender critical podcast. So at this stage, every like, share, comment and follow really helps, and we'd love to thank you all for the support so far.